today on Mini Painting Studio to continue Nolzurs Marvelous Miniatures Orc. Today I'm going to be focusing probably more on the pants and like the chainmail breastplate that is on the image. The colors that seem to be on there seem to be a grayish tone. So I'm probably going to be looking at some different various gray paints to look at those, but they also seem to have a purplish tone to them, which I don't think I'm going to be trying to be as similar to the image as I maybe have made myself out to believe, especially since the skin is blue, and obviously the skin in the image looks very similar to the pants. So I took a little bit of creative freedom with that, but it's better than looking like Thanos like it originally did. So to start off, the various gray paints again I'm going to be looking at is a ash gray. It is probably the lightest gray that I own of the Army Warpainters set, Army Paints Warpaints. Then I have the Dark Zone, a uniform gray, and I think the last one is a Necromancer's Cloak. I'll probably be using the Necromancer's Cloak for the pants today, but also there seems to be a problem with my Necromancer's Cloak and a lot of my other paints as well, where I haven't been using them as often, just because, you know, stuff comes up and the paint starts to settle, and no matter how much I shake them, they tend to settle and separate, and no matter how much shaking I do, they don't like to combine back again. So any tips out there, that'd be great. My first idea was a centrifuge that I used in chemistry class, but obviously I don't have the ability to use one of those because I don't own one. But like again, any tips for that, that'd be great, because right now what I'm doing is I'm shaking them as much as possible, which hasn't been working, and then squirting a little bit out onto the palette and hoping that it comes out right, and if it doesn't, then stirring it as much as I can with like a little palette thingy. Not really sure what it's called, apologies there, but it came out of the art set that I got the palette out of when I was like 13, quite a few years ago, so don't know what it's called. So there's not too many extensive lines on the legs. There's some crinkles, obviously, to make it look like pants that Orc is wearing, and they're crinkled, obviously. But I wish that I was a little better at learning how to do highlights. Of course, like there's like the generic tips of dry brushing and those types of things, but those can only go so far. So maybe someday I will learn to start, you know, using lighter paints to make it highlighted and things like that. So we're hoping that I will maybe learn to learn those skills a little bit more for giving better content to you guys on my Instagram, where they have the full images of most of my minis. This is the first mini that I have recorded. So the paints that I have right here, the blue is the many paints that I mixed together to make the skin tone in attempts to match the picture and not look purpley. So that's the one thing I am trying to go away from. These shoes here, I'm probably just going to paint them a simple black. They will actually end up looking different. I know it's hard to see with the camera, but the bottom paint, that doesn't look like it's mixed all the way because I didn't mix it afterwards because I am dumb, is the Necromancer's Cloak for the pants, and the one directly right of the blue is the black that I'll be using for the shoes. So right now I'm just trying to go over the legs as best as possible, trying not to smudge everywhere as best as I can, but that can only take me so far. This paint is very pigmented, which I was hoping for. The only issue I have is that it's going to take another layer or two to make sure it doesn't look too thin and streaky, sorry. And because the paints are still, because they're such, these paints are, the way they're different is that they are watered down a little bit so that it is easier to paint on a smaller object and try to thin them out so they can spread it better along a small surface and not have to, like, it's not globbed on there and all thick and gross, so you can still see all the details of your miniature. So yeah, these shoes right here, I didn't bother rinsing my brush just too much. I think I rinsed it a little bit, but for these two, it's just, they're so similar in color that just kind of wiping them off a little bit, it might stain my brush a little bit, but that brush already needs to be retired, even though I haven't painted too much with it. So as sad as that is okay. We're working on maybe getting a new flat brush very soon. But as you can kind of see in the painting, the paints are already, as they dried a little bit, because these paints actually dry fairly quickly if you do a very thin coat of it. And because I did such a thin coat, it did turn out quite streaky on there. So I'm trying to thicken that up a little bit so you can't see so much of the gray-white priming that is underneath the gray of the pants. And so you can already see that it's already looking a little thicker, and it's very shiny as it is still wet paint, but you can see less and less of the white-gray priming under the paint. So these back legs, this is one of the main things I was discussing in the first episode about the hardest points to paint on a mini. Is probably the inside of the legs, as it is usually under some sort of clothing, or it's just in between the legs and you're trying not to paint, you know, like this guy has like a little skirt behind him, and that's obviously going to, you know, get in the way of painting, and hopefully it doesn't hinder too much. So with these paints, they do get I have had a problem with the Army Painter set that I have, the Warpaints, getting settled and separated a lot. I don't know if this is just for the brand of paints in particular, or maybe this is just all mini paints out there. I'm not aware just yet because I have only used this brand. So I'm hoping that maybe there's another brand that doesn't separate as much. I just haven't gotten to use it just yet. But the Army Painter set, at least the ones that I own, have had a problem with settling. I don't know if maybe it's also just a temperature thing, as I do live in a hotter state. So maybe that could be a possibility. But overall, I do have quite a few paints that I've noticed that have settled over time. And probably maybe it was also lack of use, but I feel like paint shouldn't settle so much. But what are you gonna do about that? So as you can see, the bands actually turned out fairly well. They are actually a nice shade of gray, maybe a little darker than intended, but I do believe they fit pretty well with the image that I'm going for. So I'm going to start going a little bit more on the shoes here. I'm going to get out a smaller brush, so I really don't want to get as little black paint as possible on the platform that the orc is standing on, to prevent any, if I use a lighter color on the base, I don't want it to show through so much. Maybe if I'm using like just a lighter green to make it like thick grass, it'd be a little weird to see just a random black dot, as some of the greener paints are actually pretty thin and it would be a little hard to cover up a very pigmented dark black paint. So that's why I brought the smaller brush out. I know I've lowered myself down to realize that I really shouldn't use the thick brush right here, especially with the bristles on it have spread out as much as they have, which makes it a little more difficult to paint in a small area and prevent them from exceeding the lines, you know, don't want to paint outside the lines here. Alright, so we're just fixing up some lines here to make sure that everything is together. I don't want to go over it too much, but because the paints are very similar in color, it shouldn't be too much of an issue if the lines go over. Although I do want to prevent painting the base of the miniature, so we'll hope we don't paint too much on there. I have not decided yet what to paint there, so maybe I will have to choose a darker color depending on how much black gets onto the base. Now that I have fixed up those lines, now we're going back and fixing up the underside to make sure we get as much painted as possible so we don't have to go back later and fix them. Trying to make sure that the streakiness on the back leg, as I didn't go over it earlier, I want to make sure there's not, that it just doesn't look very thin. You don't want your paints to look like you can still see the underside of it, especially if it's not the color. If you want a darker color, you don't want a white to show through. It wouldn't turn out as well as you would want it to turn out. The paints do seem to have turned out pretty well though, and the black is very pigmented, so I don't have to worry so much about repainting those all the time. But now I can focus more on the chainmail. The chainmail, I believe, was more of a shiny black metal. It has lots of indents and protrusions that will be a little rough in painting, but hopefully it shouldn't mess up my brushes too much. It might put a little dent in some of them, as they are just very intricate, and it might make my brushes a little, put them to some work. So the paint you saw earlier that is no longer on screen, you might have saw it just for a second. I think it was just the matte black mixed with the, it was a plate mail metal paint. I'll show you later what it is. But right now I'm just kind of going over there. It's gonna take a couple tries to go over this to make sure everything is painted well, and I don't want the insides of those little chainmails. Chainmails? I don't know how to say that. In the chainmail. I don't want it to show through as gray or white, whatever that color is. So I have to make sure I get every little intricacy in there painted and not just dry brushed on top. The metallic color that I used actually turned out pretty well. Again, it's kind of might be a little hard to see on camera, but it actually is. It did turn out a little shiny, and so it did look like the black metal, more so than expected. I might have used just a little bit more of the metal tone just to make it more shiny, a little more metallic. Maybe I'll go over it later with a little dry brush of silver to see if I can get it a little more shinier as well, so it doesn't look so just dark, and make sure everything looks just so not everything on the mini is painted a dark black color. I feel like the way for the mini is also some of these things do look like furs, and so it would look a little weird if everything was just painted various shades of gray and black besides the skin. Also, getting along this back area is a bit tricky. The little fur bits around the fur bits around the back here are a little tough to get around because I don't want to paint them, as they are probably going to be painted white later and maybe toned a different color with washes, but as far as I'm aware, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But it is, I do want it to look as good as possible, and I don't want the little areas between the pokey bits, the little ups and downs of the fur to be left unpainted, and it just looks weird, and there's like it looks like I just forgot to paint a spot on the mini. But so far so good. I have made a couple of running over issues that I will fix later. As I mentioned before, I do not mind going back and fixing those by any means. I'm very used to fixing them. But hopefully as I get along, that will also be something that I do less of, hopefully. Because I do my paint with a lot of bigger brushes, this does happen a lot. So do as I say, not as I do. I do recommend using smaller brushes sometimes. You know, sometimes those are actually needed to prevent a lot of overpainting, overlayering, which might prevent some things you want to do in the future with your miniature, whether you want to highlight different areas or make areas pop more than others. I'm sure there's a list of things that it's just better for. You're not wasting your time going back over and fixing the overpainted bits. You know, the little thing when you're a kid, you know, don't paint over the lines. It's not a bad tip. Going back over and doing this is not always the most fun task, but it does keep me busy. So if you're looking for a task or a hobby to keep yourself busy, this is a very nice one. You know, put on some music, watch a TV show, anything like that. It's nice, just nice to do something with your hands while you're doing something. It does take quite a bit of your time though. I do paint my miniatures in one sitting though, which again is probably why I don't take as much time, but I do it mostly because I do go over the lines so much and I mix a lot of my paints. So going back and remixing those paints with different amounts can always be rough to try to get the exact color that I want. So if you know that you're not so much of a schmuck like me and you don't go over painting as much as I do, then you know, painting in several sittings shouldn't be a big deal. I also just do prefer to paint them in one sitting while I don't take as long as them as a lot of professionals will. So it doesn't bother me so much to do this. I usually do just to pass the time as a day that I don't have anything else to do and I just need to do something. Like I said, this is a great pastime, so if you're thinking about it, just buy a couple paints, buy one, even just one miniature, and just get yourself started. Watch a couple of videos, whether it's this one or a couple of other beginner videos that might throw you some tips. I truly believe in washes will save your life in shading. If you also live by that, I hope everything turns out well for you. And if not, well, you know what? Some of us have to start somewhere. So right now I'm just again going over this chainmail to make sure it doesn't look too choppy, and on the insides making sure no white or gray is showing through. That's the matte black, and this is the plate mail metal that I used to make the chainmail and make it look the black metallic. So I just mixed them together really quickly. The paints do tend to spurt out a little bit, but you could see how metallic that one was. So I think that's all for today. I hope that you continue with me on this journey, and thank you very much. Have a good day.